Chapter 2, 30 Pieces of Understanding. Part 1, The Student Who Couldn't Stop. James Carter hadn't slept properly in 3 weeks. It wasn't insomnia exactly, more like his brain had shifted into a gear it didn't know it had, and the clutch was stuck. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw patterns, ratios, numbers that meant something more than numbers. 70 to 30, silver to gold, law to grace. His studio apartment in the grad student housing complex looked like a conspiracy theorist's wet dream. Papers covered every surface, legal documents, biblical passages, economic histories, ancient weights and measures. String would have connected them all if James had any string. Instead, he'd settled for color-coded sticky notes and a whiteboard he'd stolen from the law school's study lounge at 2 a.m. The whiteboard currently read 70% equals circulation, silver, equals law, equals measurable, equals what we do. 30% equals foundation, gold, equals covenant, equals immeasurable, equals what we are. Question: can the 30% be quantified without destroying it? That was the question that was eating him alive, because James Carter was a quantifier, always had been, third in his class at Stanford undergrad, full scholarship to law school, 2 published articles on criminal justice reform, before he'd even graduated. He solved problems by breaking them down, analyzing them, finding the mechanisms that made them work. He was good at it, maybe too good. His laptop sat open on the desk, 17 browser tabs deep into research that started with Corpus Juris Secundum and ended somewhere in Sumerian economic records. He'd traced the gold-silver ratio across civilizations, across millennia, and found it lurking everywhere like a genetic code embedded in human society. Ancient Babylon, 1 to 13.3, close to 70-30 by weight. Biblical Israel, multiple references to silver and gold in specific ratios. Roman Empire, fluctuating but averaging around the same proportions. Medieval Europe, same pattern. Modern financial systems, the ratio buried beneath layers of abstraction, but still there. It was like discovering that every building in the world was constructed on the same hidden foundation, and nobody knew it because they'd all forgotten how to dig deep enough to see it. James looked at his phone. 4:47 a.m. He had civil procedure at 9 o'clock, and he hadn't finished the reading. Hadn't even started it, actually. He didn't care. This was bigger than civil procedure. This was the blueprint for understanding how value actually worked, how human worth was measured and mismeasured, how entire civilizations rose and fell based on whether they honored the gold beneath the silver or tried to turn everything into circulation. And Marcus had just seen it, not learned it, not studied it, not derived it through careful analysis, seen it, in prison, in suffering, in desperate prayer to a God James had stopped believing in somewhere around sophomore year, when he'd read enough Nietzsche and Foucault to feel intellectually superior to his grandfather's simple faith. But Marcus's faith was simple. It was refined like gold in fire, James thought, and then laughed bitterly at himself for thinking in metaphors like some kind of street corner preacher. He opened a new document on his laptop and started typing. Marcus Ellison, a case study in Revelation economics. He stopped, deleted it. Trying to write about Marcus felt like trying to describe music by analyzing the physics of sound waves. Technically accurate, completely missing the point. James pushed back from his desk, his chair squeaking on cheap linoleum, and walked to his tiny kitchen. Coffee. He needed coffee. He'd been mainlining it for days, which probably explained the jitters and the way his thoughts kept fragmenting into tangents that led to more tangents until he forgot where he'd started. While the coffee maker gurgled and hissed, James stared at his reflection in the microwave door. He looked like shit. Dark circles under his eyes, 3-day stubble, hair that hadn't been washed, and he couldn't remember. His phone buzzed. Text from his study group. "Where have you been? You missed property and torts. Professor Martinez asked about you." James didn't respond. He poured coffee into a mug that said, "Lawyers do it in their briefs," a gift from his mother that he'd never found funny, and walked back to his desk. The original document was still there, the one Marcus had filed. James had made Patricia give him a copy. Hadn't been hard. She'd seemed almost relieved to share it with someone, like the weight of seeing it alone was too much. "In God we," 3 words on a piece of standard office paper. James had run every analysis he could think of: linguistic, semantic, legal, historical. The phrase appeared on American currency, "In God We Trust," added in 1956 during the Cold War as a counter to godless communism. Political theory masqueraded it as piety, but Marcus's version was different, incomplete, not a declaration, a fragment, a sentence waiting for its verb, its object, its completion. "In God we," what? Trust? Too easy, too familiar, too worn smooth by repetition, until it meant nothing. Believe? Too passive, too mental, too disconnected from action. Live? Closer, but still not quite. James typed into his document. The incomplete sentence is the point. It creates a gap that the system must attempt to fill, but the system cannot fill it because the system operates on silver principles: complete, measurable, transactional, and the sentence requires gold principles: incomplete, immeasurable, covenantal. He read it back, nodded. It was good analysis. It was also completely inadequate to explain why that piece of paper made him feel like he was standing on the edge of something vast and terrifying and necessary. Part 2. The Grandfather's Ghost. James's phone rang at 6:15 a.m., just as the sun was starting to turn his window from black to gray. His mother, he almost didn't answer. She'd been calling more frequently since his grandfather died 6 months ago, and James knew she was worried about him, wanted him to come home more often, wanted him to go to church, wanted him to be the man his grandfather had raised him to be. But he answered, "Hey, Mom." "James, baby, you sound terrible. Are you sick?" "No, just tired. School's intense right now." A pause. His mother had a PhD in psychology. She could hear what people weren't saying better than most people could hear what they were. "You're not at school right now," she said. "You're somewhere else. I can hear it in your voice." James closed his eyes. His mother's superpower, the ability to read him like a text with the font size set to 72. "I'm working on something," he said. "A research project. For class?" "No, a personal interest." Another pause, longer this time. "Your grandfather used to do that," she said softly. "Get consumed by something, some question he needed to answer. He'd disappear into his study for days, come out looking like he'd been wrestling angels." James felt something tighten in his chest. His grandfather, Reverend Samuel Carter, had been a third-generation AME pastor, not the megachurch kind, the real kind, the kind who spent 40 years pastoring a church of 200 people in Oakland, who knew everyone's name and business and struggles, who buried the dead and married the young and prayed with the dying, and never got rich or famous, but somehow seemed wealthier than anyone James knew. Samuel had baptized James, had taught him to read using the Bible, had taken him to protests and community meetings, and taught him that faith without works was dead, that righteousness meant action, not just belief. And James had loved him. And then James had gone to college and learned about the Enlightenment and postmodernism and structural analysis, and had come home Christmas of freshman year full of intellectual superiority and condescension. He told his grandfather that religion was the opiate of the masses, that it was a control mechanism, that anyone with critical thinking skills could see through it. His grandfather had just smiled and said, "Then you haven't thought critically enough yet, son." They'd barely spoken after that, not from anger. Samuel didn't do anger, but from distance. James had been too smart, too educated, too sophisticated to engage with simple faith. And now Samuel was dead, and James was discovering that simple faith was actually refined faith, and he'd been too arrogant to see it. "James?" His mother's voice pulled him back. "You still there?" "Yeah, sorry, just thinking." "About Papa Sam?" "Yeah." "What would he say about this research you're doing?" James almost laughed, because he knew exactly what Samuel would say. "Be careful, son. When you find truth, it finds you back, and it'll demand more than you plan to give." "He told me to be careful," James said. "Then be careful, baby. Your grandfather knew things, saw things, lived things that your books don't talk about." After they hung up, James sat in the growing light and let himself remember. Part 3. The Third Generation. Samuel Carter's study had been a small room off the main hallway of the house James grew up in. Books floor to ceiling, a desk that had belonged to Samuel's father, who'd been a pastor too, and his father before that, making James fourth generation if he'd chosen that path, which he hadn't. James had chosen law instead, the secular priesthood, he used to joke. Same moral authority, better pay. But sitting here now at his desk covered in papers about covenant and law and the economics of grace, James wondered if he'd actually chosen differently or just chosen the same thing in different language. His grandfather had talked about the difference between religion and faith. Religion, Samuel said, was silver. It was the structures, the rituals, the measurable practices. Sunday service at 11, communion first Sunday of the month, Bible study on Wednesday, tithes and offerings counted and recorded, all necessary, all good, but all silver. Faith was gold. It was the foundation beneath the practices, the relationship that made the rituals meaningful instead of empty, the trust that couldn't be measured but held everything else in place. "You can have religion without faith," Samuel had told him once. "Plenty of people do. They show up, they sing the songs, they check the boxes, but they're just circulating silver, son, no gold underneath. Eventually it collapses." "And you can have faith without religion?" James had asked. He'd been 14, asking questions that felt rebellious and important. "Harder," Samuel had admitted. "Not impossible, but harder. Because humans need structure. We need the 70%. But if we forget the 30%, if we try to make everything measurable and controllable and systematic, we lose the whole point." Which is what? That God doesn't measure us. God sees us, knows us, counts us as righteous, not because of what we do, but because of whose we are. At 14, James had found this confusing. At 28, reading Marcus's words, he finally understood what his grandfather had been trying to teach him. The covenant wasn't a contract. Contracts were silver, reciprocal, transactional, measurable. You do X, I do Y. We're both satisfied. Deal complete. Covenants were gold, unilateral, unconditional, immeasurable. I chose you, not because you earned it, not because you deserve it, not because I get something in return, but because I see you and count you as mine. Abraham's covenant, I will make you a great nation, not if you're good enough, not as long as you obey, just I will. Isaac's covenant, I will establish my covenant with him, inherited, not earned, passed down like genetic code, like eye color, like the shape of your hands. Jacob's covenant, your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, uncountable, exceeding any system's ability to measure. James pulled up the Bible on his laptop, not from faith, just from research habit, and started reading Genesis. He'd read it before, of course, multiple times in multiple translations, back when he was still pretending to care about his grandfather's faith. But he'd read it wrong. He'd read it as mythology, as primitive attempts to explain the world, as power structures disguised as revelation. He hadn't read it as economics, but it was economics. It was a detailed record of how God valued humans compared to how humans valued each other, how God's ledger worked versus how human ledgers worked. And it was revolutionary, because in every human system James had studied, ancient or modern, Eastern or Western, capitalist or communist, value was based on productivity, on what you could do, what you could produce, what you could contribute. You were worth what you could offer, but in the biblical system, value was based on being. You were worth what you were, created in the image of God, seen by God, known by God, counted by God. That was the gold. Everything else, your work, your productivity, your contribution, that was the silver. Important, necessary, to be honored and fairly compensated, but not the foundation, never the foundation. James typed furiously, ideas coming faster than fingers could move. Modern economics has inverted the biblical ratio. We've made the 70% productivity/work/measurable output the foundation and tried to eliminate the 30% inherent worth, being, unmeasurable value entirely. This is why the system is failing, not because of capitalism or socialism or any particular political structure, but because any system that tries to make 100% measurable will eventually collapse. You cannot sustain circulation without foundation. You cannot maintain silver without gold. Marcus understood this not through study, but through experience. In prison, he was reduced to pure silver valuation, a number, a category, a statistic, productivity without personhood, labor without dignity. And in that reduction, he found the gold, the part of himself that couldn't be measured, couldn't be extracted, couldn't be commodified. The image of God that persisted even when everything else was stripped away. This is the revelation. Suffering reveals what cannot be taken. James stopped typing, read it back, felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not intellectual satisfaction, conviction. Part 4. The Meeting. James found Marcus at the community center on a Tuesday evening, teaching literacy to ex-cons in a room that smelled like instant coffee and old carpet. There were 6 men in the class, ranging from early 20s to late 50s. All of them had the same look, the prison look, the way men moved when they'd learned to take up as little space as possible, to project neither weakness nor threat, to exist in the careful neutral zone that kept you alive. Marcus was teaching them to read a bus schedule, not literature, not the Constitution, not anything elevated or academic, a bus schedule. See, the times run vertical, Marcus was saying, his voice patient, and the stops run horizontal. So if you need to get from here to downtown by 3:00 p.m., you find downtown on this column, follow it down to a time before 3:00, then follow that row back to find which stop you need to be at. One of the younger men, couldn't have been more than 22, squinted at the paper. Why they make it so complicated? Because people who make bus schedules assume everyone can read, Marcus said. And when you assume everyone can do something, you don't think about making it easier for people who can't. That's fucked up, another man muttered. It is, Marcus agreed simply, but it's also real, so we learn to navigate it. James watched from the doorway. There was something in the way Marcus taught, no condescension, no pity, no savior complex, just practical knowledge delivered with respect. The class ended at 7:30. The men filed out, some of them nodding to Marcus, one of them shaking his hand with both of his own, in that way that meant more than words. Marcus looked up and saw James. "You've been thinking," Marcus said. Not a question. "I haven't stopped thinking," James admitted. "Can we talk?" They walked to the diner, the same one as before, with weak coffee and good pie, and a waitress who still called everyone honey. They slid into a booth with cracked vinyl seats. James pulled out his laptop, I've been researching the ratio, the 70-30 split, and I'm finding it everywhere. And not just in economics and law, but in scripture, in ancient weights, in temple measurements. It's like a code embedded in reality. Marcus listened, sipping his coffee. James opened his files. Showed Marcus the graphs, the charts, the historical analysis, the biblical references, the mathematical proofs. Look at this, James said, pulling up a spreadsheet. In Exodus 30, the anointing oil recipe, the proportions of the ingredients, when you calculate the weights, it comes out to roughly 70-30. Or here in 1 Kings, the temple dimensions, the holy place to the most holy place, 2-to-1 ratio, which is 66 to 33%. Marcus nodded slowly. You're measuring the gold. James blinked. What? You're trying to quantify the 30%. Turn it into silver terms so you can understand it. Well, yeah, that's what research is, taking the unknown and making it known. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Can you explain love? What? Love. Can you explain it? Break it down. Measure it. James frowned. I mean, there's neurochemistry, oxytocin, dopamine, activation patterns in the brain. That's not love, Marcus interrupted gently. That's the biological mechanism. I asked about love itself, the thing you feel when you hold someone and know you'd die for them, when you see them hurting and it hurts you worse than any physical pain, when you make a choice that costs you everything and give nothing for them, and it feels like the only choice you could make. James opened his mouth, closed it. You can measure the effects, Marcus continued. Brain chemistry, behavior changes, physiological responses, all to 70%. But the 30%, the actual love, that stays unmeasured. Because the moment you measure it, you change it into something else. But that doesn't mean it's not real, James argued. Just because we can't measure it doesn't mean we can't understand it. Understanding and explaining aren't the same thing, Marcus said. You can understand love by experiencing it, by living it, by letting it change you. But the moment you try to explain it, to break it down into components and mechanisms and chemical reactions, you lose what makes it love. James felt frustration rising. So what, we just don't think about it? We just accept mystery and never question? I didn't say that. Marcus's voice was still gentle, but there was something underneath it, something that made James stop talking and listen. Question everything, think deeply, study hard, use your mind. It's a gift from God, and you honor God by using it well. But recognize that some things aren't meant to be explained. They're meant to be witnessed, acknowledged, honored. Marcus leaned forward. The gold doesn't need to be understood, James. It needs to be acknowledged. The moment you try to turn it into silver, to quantify it, systematize it, make it manageable, you destroy what makes it valuable. But how do I share what you've shown me if I can't explain it? Who asked you to share it? James stopped. I mean, if this is true, if this is how value really works, people need to know. Do they? Yes. Why? James stuttered. Because it could change everything. The legal system, the economic system, how we treat people, how we measure worth. All silver concerns, Marcus said. James felt like he'd been slapped. Marcus continued, his voice still kind but relentless. You want to take what you've learned and turn it into a program, a system, a reform movement. You want to explain the 30% so clearly that everyone can understand it and apply it and make the world better. What's wrong with that? Because the 30% isn't a program, James. It's not a system you implement. It's a truth you live, and living it looks different for everyone. Marcus paused, then asked, Why are you really here? James felt exposed. I told you, I want to understand. No, Marcus interrupted. You want to matter. You want to be important. You want to be the one who figured it out, who explained it, who taught the world what it's missing. The words hit James like punches. "You're smart," Marcus continued, "brilliant even, and you've spent your whole life being the smartest person in the room, the one with the answers, the one who could analyze and explain and solve." Marcus's eyes held something James couldn't quite name. Compassion, maybe, or sorrow. "But wisdom isn't the same as intelligence, son, and what you're seeking isn't understanding. It's control." Part 5. The Wound. James left the diner angry, not at Marcus, though that's what he told himself, at the unfairness of it all, the way Marcus could just make pronouncements about James's motivations without knowing him, without understanding what he was trying to do. He walked back to his apartment in the November cold, hands shoved in his pockets, breath fogging in the air. "You want to matter." The words kept echoing. "You want to be important." James climbed the stairs to his apartment, slammed the door harder than necessary, and stood in the middle of his paper-covered space feeling like a fraud. Because Marcus was right. God damn it, Marcus was right. James didn't just want to understand the revelation. He wanted to own it, to be the one who decoded it, systematized it, made it accessible, to write the paper that would make his career, to be the scholar who bridged sacred and secular, who proved that ancient wisdom and modern economics were describing the same truth. He wanted to be significant, and there was nothing wrong with that, right? Everyone wanted to matter. Everyone wanted their life to count for something, except James sat down at his desk and stared at his grandfather's photograph. Samuel at 70, standing in front of the church he'd served for 40 years, smiling that quiet smile that had nothing to prove. Samuel had mattered. James knew that. The hundreds of people at his funeral, the stories they'd told, the lives he'd touched. He'd mattered deeply, but Samuel had never tried to matter. He'd just tried to be faithful. Faithful in small things, and showing up, and listening, and seeing people, really seeing them. When the world made them invisible, Samuel hadn't built an empire or written books or made a name for himself. He just loved people, and somehow that had been enough. James felt something crack open in his chest. He'd spent years being disappointed in his grandfather, disappointed that Samuel hadn't leveraged his intelligence into something bigger, hadn't written theology that would change the world, hadn't built movements or founded organizations or made his mark. Samuel had just pastored 200 people in Oakland for 40 years. And James had thought it was a waste. But what if faithfulness in the 70% was the point? What if the 30%, the gold, wasn't something you achieved or proved or demonstrated? What if it was something you just were? James opened his laptop and stared at the document he'd been holding. Pages and pages of analysis, charts and graphs and proofs, all of it trying to capture something that couldn't be captured. He highlighted everything. His finger hovered over the delete button, but he couldn't do it. Not yet. Instead, he created a new folder, named it Witness, Not Analysis, and he started writing differently. I met a man named Marcus Ellison who spent 8 years in prison and came out knowing things about value that I spent 4 years at Stanford learning backwards. He didn't study economics. He suffered. And in that suffering, God showed him something that all our theories miss, that human worth can't be measured because it isn't performance-based. It's identity-based. We are valuable not because of what we do, but because of whose we are. I don't know how to prove this. I don't know how to systematize it. I don't even know how to fully explain it. But I know it's true, and I know that my attempt to explain it might be the very thing that destroys it. James saved the document, closed his laptop, and for the first time in 3 weeks, he slept. Part 6. The 30 Pieces. 2 months passed. James tried to balance law school with his obsession, tried being the key word. His grades slipped from top of the class to middle of the pack. His professors noticed. His study group stopped inviting him to sessions. He didn't care. He was learning something more important than civil procedure. He was learning to see, not to analyze, to see. He started noticing things he'd missed before, the way the legal system processed people like products on an assembly line, the way economic theories treated humans as rational actors, maximizing utility, completely missing the 30% that made people human. He started seeing the invisible people. The woman who cleaned the law school bathrooms at night, who nobody greeted or acknowledged. James started saying hello to her, learned her name was Rosa, that she had 3 kids, that she was studying for the GED at 43. The homeless man who sat outside the coffee shop James frequented. Not asking for money, just sitting. James started bringing him coffee. Learned his name was Thomas, that he'd been a veteran, that he'd lost everything to PTSD and the VA's bureaucratic indifference. The other law students looked at James like he'd lost his mind. Maybe he had, or maybe he'd found it. He met with Marcus weekly now, not as student and teacher. Marcus refused that dynamic, just as 2 men trying to understand what God was doing in a world that had forgotten how to measure by gold standards. "You're changing," Marcus observed one evening. They were walking through the city, nowhere in particular, just moving. "Yeah," James admitted. "I don't know if it's a good change." "Why not?" "Because I'm losing my edge, my ambition, my drive. I used to want to change the world. Now I just want to, I don't know, be present in it." Marcus smiled. "That is changing the world, son, just not in the way you thought." They walked past a construction site. Workers were tearing down an old building, preparing to put up something new. James watched the destruction, the dust, the noise. "I keep thinking about the temple," James said. "Which one?" "Solomon's, the dimensions, the measurements, the way the holy place was twice the size of the most holy place." 70-30, Marcus said. "Yeah, but here's what I'm realizing. The holy place was where the work happened. The daily sacrifices, the lighting of the lamps, the burning of incense, all the 70%. The work, the ritual, the measurable service. And the most holy place? Just presence. Just the Ark of the Covenant and the mercy seat. No work, no ritual. Just being in the presence of God once a year." "So?" James stopped walking. "So what if that's the pattern? What if the 70%, all our work and effort and productivity, is only meaningful because of the 30% foundation, the presence, the being, the gold underneath the silver?" "You're learning," Marcus said quietly. "But I still want to document it," James admitted. "I know you said not to explain it, but I can't help wanting to record it, to preserve it, to make sure it doesn't get lost." Marcus looked at him for a long moment. Then he said something that would haunt James for the rest of his life. 30 pieces of information can seem like wealth, until you realize you traded 30 years of relationship for it. Part 7. The Introduction to Sarah. Sarah Kim was everything James thought he wanted in a partner. She was brilliant, PhD student in sociology, focused on economic justice. She was passionate, had been arrested twice at protests, once for blocking an ICE detention center, once for occupying a foreclosed home. She was beautiful, not in a conventional way, but in a way people are beautiful when they're burning with purpose. They met at a community organizing meeting that James had started attending. She was presenting on mutual aid networks, systems of community support that operated outside capitalist exchange, based on gift economy principles rather than market principles. James listened to her talk about reciprocity without transaction, about giving without expectation of return, about building community wealth that couldn't be measured in dollars. She was describing the 30%. She didn't know it, but she was. After the meeting, he approached her. "That was brilliant. Have you ever studied ancient covenant economics?" She gave him a look that said she'd heard every grad student pickup line in existence and wasn't impressed. "I'm serious," James said. "What you described, gift economy, reciprocal aid, it maps perfectly onto biblical covenant structures, the 70-30 ratio." That got her attention. They went for coffee, talked for 3 hours. He told her about Marcus, about the revelation, about the gold-silver economy. She told him about her grandmother, who'd survived the Korean War by participating in a community where people shared everything: food, shelter, childcare, not because they expected repayment, but because survival required solidarity. "My grandmother called it jong," Sarah said, "emotional connection, the bonds between people that can't be transacted or measured. You can't explain jong to Americans because Americans think all relationships are contracts." "The 30%, James said. "What?" He explained the ratio, the covenant economics, the measurable versus the immeasurable. Sarah listened with intensity that made James feel simultaneously seen and examined. "So you're saying," she said slowly, "that every functioning society needs 30% of its value system to be non-transactional? Based on being, not doing?" "Exactly. And capitalism is trying to monetize that 30%, turn it into commodity." "Yes, which is why everything feels like it's dying even though GDP keeps growing." "Exactly." Sarah leaned back in her chair. "Who is this Marcus guy? I need to meet him." Part 8. The Convergence. James introduced Sarah to Marcus a week later. They met at the community center. Marcus was fixing a broken table when they arrived. Simple carpentry, the kind of work you do because something's broken and you have the skill to fix it. "Marcus, this is Sarah Kim. She's working on economic justice through mutual aid networks," Marcus said, not looking up from the table. "Yeah, James mentioned you." Sarah raised an eyebrow at James, who shrugged. "I've heard about you too," Sarah said to Marcus. "James says you've figured out the economics of grace." Now Marcus did look up. "I haven't figured out anything. I just got taught some things when I was too broken to resist learning." "Prison," Sarah said, not a question. 8 years, Folsom." "Well, what were you in for?" "Armed robbery, hurt someone, did my time." Sarah didn't flinch. "And that's where you learned about gold and silver?" "That's where I learned I wasn't worth anything according to the system, and that's when God showed me the system was measuring wrong." They talked for 2 hours. Sarah asked questions that were sharper than James's, more practical, more focused on application. "How do you implement this?" she asked. "How do you build a society on covenant principles when everything is structured around contract?" "You don't implement it," Marcus said. "You live it, and you bear witness to it, and you trust that truth is more contagious than lies, even if it spreads slower." "That's not a strategy." "No," Marcus agreed. "It's faith." Sarah frowned. "I'm not religious." "Neither am I," Marcus said, "but I am faithful." "What's the difference?" "Religion is silver, structure, ritual, measurable practice. Faith is gold. Trust that can't be measured but holds everything else in place." Sarah and James exchanged glances. "You're saying we need both," Sarah said. "The 70 and the 30. Marcus confirmed. "Systems and spirit, structure and grace. You can't have one without the other. Try to make everything structure, it becomes rigid and dead. Try to make everything spirit, it becomes chaos." "So how do you maintain the balance?" Marcus smiled. "You remember the foundation. You protect the 30%. You don't let it get commodified or measured or turned into silver. You honor it as sacred." "Sacred," Sarah repeated. "Like religious sacred?" "Like valuable beyond price sacred. Like this is the ground we stand on sacred. Like if we lose this, we lose everything sacred." Part 9. The documentation begins. After that meeting, Sarah and James started working together. They began documenting everything, not to publish, not yet, but to preserve, to create a record of what Marcus was teaching, what they were learning, what they were seeing in the world once they knew how to look. Sarah brought her sociological framework. James brought his legal analysis. Together, they built what they called the Covenant Project, a comprehensive study of how covenant economics appeared throughout history and how it might be applied to modern systems. They interviewed people in mutual aid networks. They studied indigenous economic systems. They researched biblical Jubilee principles and how they compared to modern debt forgiveness proposals. They found a pattern everywhere. Successful communities always protected some percentage of value as non-transactional. Family relationships, artistic creation, spiritual practice, play, rest, beauty, these things were kept outside the market, not because they weren't valuable, but because their value couldn't be measured without destroying it. And every civilization that tried to commodify everything, to turn 100% into market transactions, eventually collapsed. "It's the 30%, James said one night as they worked in his apartment. Papers everywhere, whiteboards covered in diagrams, coffee cups forming geological strata on every surface. "The 30% is civilization insurance," Sarah agreed. "It's what keeps the 70% from cannibalizing itself." They were documenting, systematizing, creating frameworks. They were turning gold into silver, and they didn't realize it. Part 10. The 30 Pieces Offered. The email came on a Tuesday. Subject line: "Interested in your research." Sender: David Chen, Senior Policy Advisor, Federal Reserve Bank. James's hands shook slightly as he opened it. "Mr. Carter, your name was given to me by Dr. Janet Reeves, formerly of the Open Market Committee. She mentioned you were working on novel approaches to economic valuation that incorporate non-market value assessments. We're currently conducting a study on economic resilience and would like to discuss your research. Would you be available for a consultation? Compensation commensurate with expertise. Best regards, David Chen." James read it 3 times, called Sarah immediately. "They want to talk to us about the research," he said, hearing the excitement in his voice and hating it slightly. "Who's they?" "Federal Reserve, policy advisors." Silence on the other end. "Sarah?" "James, you understand what this is, right? An opportunity to actually influence policy, to get these ideas into—" "It's co-optation," Sarah interrupted. "They want to take what we've learned and turn it into another tool for managing the system. They want to understand covenant economics so they can game it." "You don't know that." "Don't I? When has the system ever genuinely reformed itself? It absorbs critique. It co-opts resistance. It turns revolution into marketing." "Or," James argued, "they're genuinely trying to fix things. Janet Reeves was. She got fired for it, but she tried." "And what happened to her?" James didn't answer. "I'm not doing it," Sarah said. "I'm not letting them take this and turn it into Federal Reserve acknowledges unmeasurable value while they keep extracting wealth and crushing people." "So we just keep it to ourselves? We don't even try?" "We live it, James. Like Marcus said, we bear witness. We don't explain it to the people whose job is to maintain the system that's killing us." They argued for an hour. It ended badly. Not with resolution, but with exhaustion and hurt feelings. James didn't respond to the email that day, or the next, but on the 3rd day he did. "Mr. Chen, I'd be interested in a preliminary conversation. No commitment, but willing to discuss the research and see if there's alignment. James Carter." He told himself he was just exploring options. He told himself he could protect the gold while explaining the silver. He told himself he was being strategic, not compromising. But somewhere deep in his chest, in a place he was trying very hard not to examine, James Carter felt the first crack of betrayal forming. Not betrayal of Marcus, betrayal of himself. Betrayal of the truth he'd glimpsed. Betrayal of the gold for 30 pieces of silver recognition. Part 11. Marcus Knows. James didn't tell Marcus about the Federal Reserve contact for 2 weeks, but when they met for their usual coffee, Marcus already knew. He didn't say how. He just looked at James with those eyes that saw too much and asked, "When's the meeting?" James felt his stomach drop. "How did you—" "Doesn't matter. When is it?" "Next Tuesday. Just preliminary. Just to discuss the research." Marcus nodded slowly. "You're going to explain it to them." "I'm going to share what we've learned. Maybe they can use it to make actual changes." "James." Marcus's voice was gentle, which somehow made it worse. "You can't explain gold to people whose wealth depends on not understanding it." "That's cynical." "No, son, that's realistic. The system doesn't want to be reformed. It wants to be sustained, and it sustains itself by absorbing anything that challenges it, turning it into another commodity, another measurement, another way to maintain control." "So we just give up? We just let things stay broken?" "We live differently. We bear witness. We trust that truth is stronger than lies, even when the lies have better marketing." James felt anger rising, the anger of someone who knows they're wrong but isn't ready to admit it yet. "That's easy for you to say," James said, voice tight. "You don't have student loans. You don't have pressure to publish. You don't have a career to build. You can just exist on the margins and call it faithfulness." Marcus didn't flinch. "You're right. I don't have those pressures. Prison took everything from me. My career, my prospects, my future. All I have left is truth. So that's what I give." "Well, some of us still have futures to think about." "Do you?" Marcus asked quietly. "Or do you have anxieties to feed?" The question hit like a slap. James stood up. "I'm going to the meeting. I'm going to share what we've learned. And if it makes a difference, if it actually helps people, then it'll be worth it." Marcus just looked at him with something that might have been sorrow or might have been recognition of a pattern he'd seen before. 30 pieces of understanding, Marcus said. Judas didn't betray Jesus for money, you know. He betrayed him for clarity, for the ability to explain what Jesus was doing, to make it make sense to the authorities, to bridge the gap between kingdom and empire. "I'm not Judas." "We all are, son. Every time we choose explanation over mystery, every time we choose control over faith, every time we try to turn gold into silver because silver is safer." James left without saying goodbye. Part 12. The Ratio Revealed in Self. That night, James couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Marcus's words circling his brain like vultures. 30 pieces of understanding. He got up, walked to his desk, opened his laptop, started calculating. If the 30% was gold, the unmeasurable, the sacred, the foundation, and he was about to try to explain it, quantify it, make it accessible to the Federal Reserve, what was he trading? He opened his research, hundreds of pages, months of work, insights that had changed how he saw the world. 30 major findings. He'd organized them that way for the presentation. 30 key insights about covenant economics. 30 pieces. James felt sick. He opened a new document and started writing. Not analysis, not explanation. Confession. "I understand now what my grandfather meant when he said the third generation loses what the first generation found. The first generation, my great-grandfather, lived it, suffered for it, built churches and communities on covenant principles without calling them that. The second generation, my grandfather, preserved it, taught it, bore witness to it. The third generation, me, is trying to explain it, systematize it, make it acceptable to the powers that be. And in doing so, I'm destroying it. because the 30% isn't meant to be explained to the 70%. It's meant to ground the 70%, to remind the measurable that it rests on the unmeasurable. I wanted to matter. I wanted to be the bridge, the translator, the one who could speak both languages. But some things lose their power when they're translated. Some truths die when they're explained. And I'm holding 30 pieces of understanding, and I finally realize what Judas realized too late, that clarity can be a betrayal, that understanding can be a crucifixion, that some truths are meant to be lived, not leveraged. James saved the document, titled it Confession Number 1. And then he did something he hadn't done since he was a child in his grandfather's church. He prayed. Not to a God he fully believed in, not with words he was sure would be heard, just prayed. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know if you're even there, but if you are, if Marcus is right and there's gold beneath all this silver, then help me see it. Help me stop trying to measure it. Help me stop trying to matter and just be faithful, whatever that means. It wasn't a good prayer. It wasn't eloquent or theologically sound, but it was honest. And somewhere in the city, in a rooming house on the east side, Marcus Ellison woke from sleep with tears on his face and a certainty in his heart. The follower was beginning to understand. The 30 pieces were being counted. The pattern was repeating, and God was working, not to prevent the betrayal, but to redeem it, because that's what God did with crosses, turned instruments of death into mechanisms of life, turned betrayal into revelation, turned 30 pieces of silver into the price of the world's salvation.